Can you hear me today? Somebody say yes.
Yes, Professor.
Good. Thank you very much. Hi there. I know that the last lecture did not get recorded, but it doesn't really matter because I'm going to, in brief style, sort of review the Qing period. Then we'll proceed. Following that, we'll complete the narrative of Chinese history, and then we'll do the review questions. This will probably extend over into the next lecture, and then onwards to the end of term, which deals with basically the triumph of the left, of the West, and the slavery and its part in what happened to Africa during the early modern and modern period. Are there any questions about this or anything else? Okay, so we were looking at the Qing period, which I remind you, this is the period of Manchu domination from 1644 until 1911. And in this period, of course, Manchuria became part of China. The Manchus were the rulers, and the Han, who constituted the great majority, were underneath them. And of course, the Manchus employed many Han Chinese from the upper class, the mandarins, as elements of the bureaucracy. And as I was saying last time, the Manchus in the 18th century, they centralized the bureaucracy. They launched important military expeditions against and incorporated Mongolia, eliminating the threat from Mongolian invasion. Remember the Great Wall and so on. There's a whole history of invasion from the steppe. This comes to an end. And also Tibet in the southwest became part of China. And of course, these areas are contested even today in the West. The British and the Americans particularly use Tibet and sort of the Uyghurs and so on in their own sort of struggles with the Chinese state. In any case, between 1680 and 1790, we can say that this was a period of peace and prosperity in China, but underneath, there were problems. And these were carried over from the Ming period. That is to say, the constant rise in population, the development or the redevelopment of
Can you
land.
mention,
Yes.
can you mention the period the time period you just said for prosperity?
Okay. 1680 to 1790.
Thank you.
The population pressure continued, rising rents with that. And underneath, you have the problem that the problem is, to use economic lingo, language, was the problem of what we call involutionary growth. That is to say, growth continued, but the way it worked was, instead of increases in productivity per capita, based on technological innovation and capital investment in the land, or for that matter, in manufacturing, basically more and more labor, rather than the investment of capital, you have the investment of family labor in making the land as productive as possible. And sooner or later, the possibility of increasing economic growth by investing more and more labor, it becomes marginal. You can't. There's a limit to how much family labor can go into making things more productive. And this problem, it was already a problem under the Ming, but it continued in the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. However, it should be said, while this is all true, China, these economists say, had the wrong kind of growth, basically based on people working harder rather than machines doing the work. Well, nevertheless, we can say that in some particularly prosperous areas of China, like the lower Yangtze, you remember that the Yangtze is the main river. It's like the Mississippi River or the St. Lawrence, and there's a fantastic land there. There's a huge commercial development there. Historians have noted that at the end of the 18th century, the wealth of this area was comparable to any place in Europe, including England. England, which was by this point in the vanguard of capitalist development. Nevertheless, these kinds of places in China were extremely prosperous. That's one aspect of it. And another aspect that I pointed out was that the Chinese state, faced with growing population problems, did respond by basically sending colonists, particularly into southwestern China. 20 million Chinese were sponsored by the state, were assisted by the state in migrating to these new areas. Furthermore, in terms of economic progress, we can say that this was a period of continued commercial growth, and so the growing and export of cotton, silk from the mulberry.
Professor.
Yes, so just one second. And also corn, which was a very nutritious, calorie-rich food, became generalized in China. Yes.
What is the impact of the 20 million people getting sent into the West? Why did you mention that?
Because it's an outlet. These people don't have enough land, these colonists, and so sending them to southwestern China sort of the landless or nearly landless peasants acquire land and are able to sustain their people.
I see. So that it was basically just a way to get rid of the overpopulation.
Yes, well, I wouldn't just be completely dismissive. You know, I mean, like, they did similar things happened with respect to North America or Australia. A lot of so-called surplus population was sent outside of Europe to these places, to places like Winnipeg, Manitoba. Okay, you get it?
Okay, I see.
Yes. So there were these, well, there was cotton, silk, there was corn, and especially tea. There was a rage for tea in China, and a lot of land was devoted to producing tea. But on a world scale, the Europeans, and particularly the English, got a taste for tea. And so tea, alongside silk and porcelain, became a big export product for China. And also, I would say that the Manchus, the king, were, in terms of Confucianism, the state was a bit more permissive than it had been under the Ming, and the commentaries on Confucius that were produced. And of course, Confucius, that is the main thing, of course. It's the state ideology, and that continues to be the case under the king. But I noted that the commentaries tend to be a little bit somewhat more open. They're more positivist, they're more open to fact, they're more open to history than under the Ming. That being said, the underlying problems that I've already outlined, they were not resolved. Certainly the middle class was suppressed, the class that might have liberated China from these problems, and I've explained why that was so. The middle class, certainly all everywhere in the world, that class is potentially liberating in terms of producing more. Of course, it has its own problems, and we're dealing with those problems as I speak. But back then, producing more was important to break out of this sort of population problem and so on. It was a universal problem, and only the middle class could provide it, and they were suppressed. At the end of the 18th century, just before 1800 and then after, you begin to see popular sort of unrest developing in China. Secret societies are being formed in the cities. The state doesn't allow any dissent, but nevertheless, in the cities, you begin to see some landlords, some merchants, some of the unsuccessful students for the Mandarin exams. They begin to join secret societies, and also you begin to see a certain amount of unrest amongst the ethnic minorities. And there are a series of revolts, even close to Beijing, which are suppressed. So that's a sign of unrest. The state, people begin to talk more and more about corruption. The state, the corruption of government bureaucrats. But the real problem were the foreigners, and especially the English. They took advantage of the problems that I've just discussed, as you'll see in a few minutes. Now, in terms of the English trading with China, it was the English East India Company, which, of course, had already conquered India, and also with the conquest of India, the English East India Company became, I would say, the dominant power in Asia as a whole. And unlike the Portuguese or the Dutch, who were never really able to control the merchants of all of Asia, the English East India Company, by the end of the 18th century, had developed sufficient power, commercial and otherwise, that they came to sort of dominate commercial activity in Asia. And as for China, the English East India Company mainly traded through the southern port of Canton. That became the major entrepot, the major sort of merchant center for English trade with China. And at Canton, there was a Chinese trade guild who were the intermediaries between the English merchants and the Chinese market. A Chinese trade guild, which was approved by the government, basically allowed the English to trade. And the trade did develop in the second half of the 18th century. And as you would expect, the English merchants, they were interested in Chinese porcelain, Chinese silk, Chinese medicines, and increasingly in tea. Tea became really important in the second half of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. So that was what the English bought. But what did the English sell to the Chinese? Well, they tried to sell woolen goods. England was fantastically successful in Europe and elsewhere with selling its woolens, and the Industrial Revolution is going on. So the English were able to sell, were not, but they were not able to sell in China because nobody was interested in English woolen goods. There was no interest in this product. The English also tried to sell some of their lead and tin. England produced lead and tin, and so they sold a certain amount. But what they did do is they began to take control of the trade in the Philippine Islands and in Indonesia. And of course, they had control of India. So these countries produced certain products like pepper, like saltpeter, like rice, even some cotton goods from India, also rattan, which is used to produce wicker. These are Asian products, and the English East India Company bought these products at a cheap price and sold them in China, but it did not really begin to address the trade deficit that the English were running with China. And as I explained last time, when the English when the English king wrote to the Chinese emperor urging that in return for all that the English were buying, please buy our manufactures, he wrote to the emperor, wrote back politely saying no, because we have everything we need in the way of manufacturers. There's nothing we lack. And I stressed all the time that China was a largely self-sufficient country. So the Chinese refused. And so the English had to sell more and more silver. They had to bring more and more silver to China in order to secure these products. And the problem of the growing popularity of tea made the balance of payments problem for England worse and worse. The growing consumption of tea in England became problematic. Now, in terms of tea drinking, it was the Dutch who actually introduced Europe to the drinking of tea. Tea became fashionable in the course of the 17th century, and it was the Dutch who, of course, were operating in Asia, through the 17th century. Who first brought this product in large quantities into Europe. And the English, as I said, became particularly addicted to tea. The first imports of tea arrived in England in 1664, and from that point onwards, the tea imports grew larger and larger. And let me say something about this. We see that in the course of the 16th and 17th century, that so we have the development of people drinking tea, and this habit of drinking tea, actually the working class, even in England, that was emerging with the Industrial Revolution, they drank tea. Tea became indispensable to families in the course of the 18th and early 19th century, even working class families. And another thing that became indispensable was tobacco from the New World. That was another stimulant that the people began to consume in large amounts in the course of the 18th century, including working people. And finally, coffee. What you have in the course of the 18th century is the development of the coffee house. The cafe appears in Europe and becomes extremely popular among people all across Europe in the towns. Cafes like Starbucks and other, Starbucks didn't appear, but the equivalent in the 18th century. These were really popular, and people would socializing in these coffee houses was really important. So I would say that these are new features of European society, and scholars have pointed out that all three of these products, coffee, tea, and tobacco, are stimulants, and they go with a faster pace through society. As capitalism developed in Europe and the pace of work for all people accelerated, people need stimulants to get by. And so these stimulants plays a big role in the development of capitalism and industrialism in the 17th and 18th century. Today we have a similar spread of a drug. Can anybody think of a drug that's become very popular and indeed even legal in recent years here in Canada?
Well, I mean, cannabis, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, of course. On every street corner now, there's a shop. And believe me, they thought about this. It's not merely that they want to legalize it and collect the revenue. It's also a way that people can get by. It's hard. Life is hard. So the smoking up a bit or consuming some candy, some people find this the way of coping, so on. It's related to the kind of society that we're living in. Any comments about that? I could do a survey now. How many of you consume cannabis? But I won't. Any case, as I said, more and more tea was consumed, and the state, especially dealing with this problem of balance of payments, tried to tax this. And it became a real problem. The tea, the English state tried to derive a certain amount of revenue. Well, there was problems. A lot of merchants basically were refused to pay the tax, and it became a real issue in England in the 18th century. So the English government decided, well, we'll try and tax the American colonists. And so they did try in the 1770s. Does anybody know what happened? What happened? Well, the Americans refused. There were a number of issues, but one of them was tea. And the Americans refused, and a group of American colonists in Massachusetts dumped the whole shipload of tea, British tea, into Boston Harbor. This became a prelude to the American Revolution, and a general protest of the Americans developed. And instead of drinking tea, they started to drink coffee. This is how coffee became the beverage in the United States. Well, that started with the whole issue of paying tax to the British government. So to return to this question of the balance of payments problem and so on with the British, so the British and other Europeans had to send silver to get Chinese products, and the Chinese continued to receive a huge amount of silver from Europe and from England. Of course, one thing to say is that the tea growing and the commercialization of tea was big business in China. At the same time, I would note that there was a certain change in European and especially English attitudes toward China in the course of the 18th century. Now, when the Europeans encountered China in the 16th and 17th century, and including the first part of the 18th century, Europeans were generally impressed. Of all the overseas civilizations that we've discussed, when the Europeans encountered the Chinese, they were more impressed with China than they were with any other civilization. And the reason for that was the Chinese were well-governed. It was a well-governed society. In fact, the Europeans, including the English, said that it was better governed than European states. And I've already explained this. The bureaucrats, the mandarins, Confucianism created a highly stable society. And the upper class was, generally speaking, very literate, cultivated. The manners were exquisite. The food was exquisite. And so Europeans were overall very impressed. But as conditions deteriorated in the second half of the 18th century, you begin to see from travelers' accounts that the Europeans became increasingly contemptuous of the situation in China. They remarked on the incredible growth of poverty and corruption in the society. And from being sort of impressed with the Chinese, it became, as I say, contemptuous and even racist. Generally speaking, the Europeans were racist, ethnocentrism, but also the Europeans, they dominated the Muslims by this point. They dominated the Africans. They dominated the indigenous populations of the Americas. So the Europeans, by the 18th century, felt themselves, white Europeans, as being superior to everybody else. Well, now the Chinese were included. Well, so there's this problem, balance of payments, what to do. Well, the East India Company in English found an answer, and the answer was opium. That opium produced in India became the means, the commodity that the English could. It turned out that there was a huge demand for opium in India. And opium was already a big seller in India. Opium had been produced in northern India for centuries and was consumed. There were some people who were addicts, but it was part of Indian society, and it had its place. I could say it wasn't it wasn't threatening to undermine Indian society. When the East India Company, the English East India Company, took over India, there was a certain amount of revenue that they could derive from taxing opium. So they set up in 1773 the English East India Company, which was bringing more and more of India under its control, set up a state monopoly over opium, and the English East India Company was the beneficiary. But then they realized, well, maybe we can sell this stuff in China. And so using certain merchant groups in India who dealt with opium, there were the Parsis. That's a group, merchant group in India. That they are a religious sect. That they are most of the families are merchants. They became the merchant group under the auspices of the English East India Company that began to sell opium on the Chinese market, unloading the opium at Canton, which is the main port. Now, you should note also that the Americans, even before the American Revolution, got into this trade as well. It turned out to be extremely lucrative. The Chinese really had a taste for opium. And so the Americans from Massachusetts, the Americans were, they were developing their own merchant trade through these really advanced merchant vessels known as Yankee Clippers. I've described these merchant trading vessels way back in the class. Well, the Yankees, the Americans, produced really fine merchant ships out of Massachusetts in the 18th century. And these ships were plying the seven seas alongside the British and the French and so on. And so the Yankees of Massachusetts began to, they sailed to Turkey in the Mediterranean. There, opium was being produced. And so they got a hold of this opium and they would bring it to China, across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, into the Indian Ocean, to China. So the Americans, in fact, a distinguished American by the name of Henry Yale, he made a fortune, became a millionaire selling opium. He was running these Yankee Clippers to China. Henry Yale, the founder of Yale University, he got into this trade and made a fortune and endowed Yale University in this way. Well, in China, in fact, the regime had declared opium illegal, but it was so immensely profitable that the Chinese merchants didn't care, and certainly the English merchants didn't care, or the Parsis, and so they continued, in defiance of the Chinese state, to import increasing volumes of this opium into China. And there were open battles between government officials trying to stop it. And the merchants hired gangs of criminals, and they corrupted many government officials, bringing in this opium. And as a result of all of this, addiction increased massively, especially in southern China. A large percentage of the population basically became dope addicts as a result. So we can see that by the beginning of the 19th century, the Europeans, especially the English, had found something that they could sell to the Chinese that the Chinese would buy. And this became the English answer. And the result was something historic happened. In addition to the corruption, of course, of the addiction of millions and millions of Chinese, the balance of payments reversed. That is to say, the Chinese, by the 1820s, 1830s, had to export more silver than was being brought in. So their balance of payments became negative. Now, this was a historic because the Chinese balance of payments had been positive since the 16th century, especially because the Europeans had to bring silver to buy Chinese products. Well, they continued to buy these products, but the opium trade proved to be so enormous that the balance of payments was reversed. Indeed, things became so bad that in order for the Chinese government to raise revenue to continue to carry out normal governmental operations, the Chinese state had to raise taxes on the peasantry. There was a significant increase in taxation in the first part of the 19th century in China because to cover expenses, the only way that the Chinese state could do this was by raising taxes. And so, of course, this made the situation of the peasants worse. I've already described the situation of the peasants, but it became worse. Well, the situation by the 1830s was so bad that we can say that especially the problem of addiction, but also landlordism and corruption, heavy taxes, secret societies, landlordism, and the underlying problems of overpopulation, land shortage, and so on, clearly Chinese society was disintegrating. And so a real crisis developed by the beginning of the 1830s. And to bring this to a head, in 1839, the King Emperor issued a proclamation prohibiting, ordering all of the officials to basically, once again, prohibit the import and consumption of opium. Well, how did the English government respond? It said, we do not accept this prohibition. It's an interference, and get this, it's an interference in free trade, in free enterprise. And if the Chinese government will not rescind this proclamation, the British will go to war in order to protect the opium trade in China in the name of free trade. And this is exactly what happened. In 1839, war broke out between China and England, or Britain. The British fleet and then Marines wreaked havoc in China on the coast. And after 3 years of war, the Chinese were forced to make peace with the British. And the British imposed a huge indemnity, and they forced the Chinese to cede the port of Hong Kong, to basically open up Hong Kong. This is how Hong Kong became a British colony by this treaty in 1842. But also other ports were forced open. And this was the beginning of basically the full intrusion of British and then European in colonialism and imperialism on China in the 19th and into the early 20th century. Now, the Chinese, of course, they tried to resist later. This incident is known as the First Opium War. There was a Second Opium War in the 1860s, and again, the Chinese were humiliated by the British, and then all of the French, the Germans, the Russians, they all got into the game, and they basically began to divide up China in the succeeding decades. Well, the Chinese did resist. There was the Taiping Rebellion. The peasants, in particularly southern China, between 1850 and 1864, there's something called the Taiping Rebellion. There it is on the, you can see it. Wait a minute. At the bottom of this list of things, Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. A huge peasant uprising. You know, I've explained the role of peasant uprising in China in previous centuries. Well, this was an enormous peasant uprising. I think it was the largest single event globally in history in the 19th century. Millions and millions of Chinese peasants rebelled against the landlords, against the Manchu state, the Qing state, against the foreigners. And it was interesting because the leader of this peasant insurrection was a sort of a disappointed candidate for the mandarinate, sort of an intellectual from a peasant family, but an intellectual who actually had a revelation. And the revelation was that he was the younger son of Christ. So it was the name of Christianity, of a kind of variant of Christianity. It wasn't certainly Roman Catholicism or Protestantism, but Christianity had become very important in China or significant. Certainly didn't rival with Buddhism and so on, but it had a certain presence. Well, this peasant intellectual, he took up Christianity, used it as an ideology to arouse the peasants. And it was only after 14 years that the Chinese government, with the help of the British and French, brought this rebellion under control. And ultimately, 20 million peasants perished in the Taiping Rebellion. You can imagine, this is enormous. And of course, the Chinese only began to recover with the overthrow of the king in 1911, and finally, but the king, of course, the Chinese Republic in 1911 was proved incapable. This republic was controlled by the middle class, especially in the face of Japanese imperialism, and ultimately it was Mao Zedong and the peasant revolution that he led, which allowed the communists to come to power in 1949, that put an end to this Western imperialism and allowed for the emergence of China to what it is today. So that's a story. Does anybody have any questions about the story I've told? Okay, let me ask you a question. Maybe we can get a little. What should we say about the fact that the English that they were fully aware of the problems of addiction in China? The people were becoming dope addicts and so on. But they, there was a lot of money at stake, but they also had this idea of free trade. First of all, I'd ask you, where did they get this idea of free enterprise? That you shouldn't interfere with the market. It was a religious principle for the English. You have to understand, it's a religion. Where did they get it from? Where did it come from? Anybody know? Well, it was Adam Smith.
Oh,
Sorry.
but Adam Smith's not that wouldn't be part of a religious.
No, that's true.
Okay.
But if you read the novels of Dickens, he's wonderful, Dickens. It's clear that the English middle class took it up as a religion. It was a religion. The idea of laissez-faire, don't interfere with the market, and reduce the level of government to a minimum. Well, these became the basic principles according to which the English economy operated. And indeed, in the case of sort of the Irish famine in 1846, as you know, several million Irish people died because there was a failure of the potato crop in England. And the English government refused to interfere because they said, well, there's a dearth of supplies. So if you leave the market to itself, well, the market will ultimately supply the food. Well, there was no market and the food was not supplied and millions of people died. Same thing happened in India in 1870. The British reacted the same way and millions of people died there. So I'm saying it was a kind of religion. Of course, it was the religion it was the official ideology of the period we've just lived through, neoliberalism. They just brought it back. And for a while, people went for it. Of course, it all collapsed with the financial crisis of 2008. Only economists in universities still believe in the free market. They still believe it, but nobody else does. So what do you make of this whole thing? And should, any comments about it? Let me raise the question of, well, I would say that this is a heinous, this was a terrible event, and the British bear responsibility. Of course, what they say is today, oh, there's an absence of democracy in Hong Kong. Oh, it's terrible. The British never practiced democracy in Hong Kong, never, until the end. But they talk about the lack of democracy in Hong Kong, forgetting the history of Hong Kong, what they did there. It's all forgotten. And amnesia plays a huge role in today's world. People forget. That's what the establishment depends on. People forgetting. They don't know what's going on. They have no sense of historical context. It's a pity. But I would say that it raises a fundamental question, which I would like to end with. And that is the question of historical evaluation, historical judgment, and morality. To what extent is, for example, I have just condemned the British for basically addicting millions of Chinese to opium. To what extent is that justifiable? Because if you're doing history, your first obligation is to the facts. You have to have a certain sort of intellectual rigor and a kind of pessimism of the mind, where you have to find out what really went on. That's your primary responsibility, because it's pointless to sort of point to some historical event and so on, and you don't even know what happened. So determining what the facts are very important, and the reasons why things happen. This sort of realist view. But it does raise the question of, to what extent is one entitled to then pass moral judgment on events? We could say the same thing, for example, about say the German Holocaust of the Jews during the World War II, or the American bombing of Hiroshima with atomic weapons. There are these events that happen. To what extent can one moralize? And I guess, does anybody have any thoughts about this? Yes. Well, I would say that I think one can and should moralize, because in the end, if you don't moralize, then, and the sort of realistic view sort of is that you take that as your view, and of course all of it comes from Machiavelli, of course. That is a form of moral judgment. You don't care. That is a moral position itself, and in of itself, I don't care. So I think from a philosophical point of view, you can moralize. At the same time, you have to realize that moralizing, it can have a certain effect on governments if people are humanitarian. People have a sense of morality and so on, and they judge events and so on. But in terms of the actual events, wringing one's hands and moralizing in the end, it doesn't really affect what really went on. So I think with that, I'll close today's lecture, and we're going to deal with the review questions and then move on in the next class.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.